Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Is Hamas' surprise attack on Israel a game changer in the Middle East? Let's get to the bottom line. It was unprecedented for both Palestinians and Israelis. Hundreds of fighters from the Palestinian group Hamas broke through the fence that Israel maintains around the Gaza Strip and attacked Israeli military bases, civilian neighborhoods, and a large rave music festival. Israel was caught off guard, despite the fact that it maintains an intense surveillance network of Palestinians. Around 1,000 Israelis have been killed, and more than 100 have been taken back to Gaza as hostages. Israel declared war on the Gaza Strip, which it has occupied for more than 50 years, now cutting off water, electricity, and food to the millions of people who live there. Israeli bombing has killed hundreds of Palestinians and displaced hundreds of thousands. U.S. President Joe Biden has pledged support to Israel and even ordered the biggest warship in the world, the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier, to the eastern Mediterranean. So is this surprise attack leading to something geostrategically larger? How do the big players in the region, like Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, fit into this bigger picture? Today, we're talking to Stephen Walt, professor of international relations at Harvard University and author of several books, including The Israel Lobby in U.S. Foreign Policy and The Hell of Good Intentions, American Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of U.S. Primacy. Professor Walt, I really appreciate you being here. We've had many discussions on the geostrategic fault lines in the world and how the different players are moving. So we have another eruption right now of a hot conflict in the Middle East, which you know so well. Does this particular hot conflict between Hamas and Israel mean anything different today than the many others that have preceded it in the past?
Yeah, I think this is different for a variety of different reasons. I mean, first of all, I think it has shattered the sense of impunity that Israel had for many years, that it had been able to wall off the Palestinian problem and that most Israelis could go about their lives without feeling like it was directly affecting them. And that's clearly been shattered by this. And that's going to have, I think, far-reaching implications for Israeli domestic politics. Second, it has certainly put on hold the normalization process that was underway, or at least being attempted, between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Whether that's on hold permanently or just temporarily will depend a little bit on how things evolve here. But I think it has actually broader implications even beyond those immediate things. I mean, first of all, we're seeing a temporary unity within the West, the sort of rallying of not just the United States, but Europe, very much in response to the brutal nature of Hamas's attacks, and in particular the attacks on civilians. But I think we're going to see a somewhat different reaction in much of the global South, not approving of what Hamas has done, but being more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and more concerned by what they see as the selective attention of the West, that we worry greatly about these conflicts, but not about conflicts equally brutal that are taking place in other parts of the world. So the divide we've seen on Ukraine between, say, the West and the South, I think is going to be apparent here as well. And then finally, you mentioned Iran. I think there is a non-trivial risk of escalation here, particularly if it is determined that Iran was actively involved in the planning of this operation. Everyone knows that Iran has supported Hamas in the past and continues to do so. But if they were actively involved in planning, then Netanyahu is going to be under great pressure to do something about Iran. And that's how this starts to get bigger in a variety of different ways.
Well, let's talk about the Iran dimension of this for a moment. And I want to be careful here because I want to tell our audience that there's a lot of material about there ascribing responsibility to different players with pretty thin evidence in my particular view. And so I'm just interested in how you see it and how much time will it take to rationally process what we've just seen unfold.
Yeah, this is a real concern here. I mean, this is one of these moments where we should all be somewhat humble about how much we understand about what happened and where this is all going to lead, because, of course, where this goes depends in part on what the decisions that people make now, and none of us can be completely certain how things will look in a couple of weeks. So a certain amount of humility is called for. So the question of Iranian involvement is an important one, but I think the early bits of evidence that have come out are certainly not definitive, and that's going to require a little bit of time to try and determine it. If it does appear to be clear cut that Israel or that Iran was directly involved in these attacks, then I think again the pressures for escalation go up, because it will be hard for the Israeli government to do nothing about that. And that's again one of the dangers I see here, that this could get actually much bigger than it is already.
Are we seeing something where Israeli leaders in their response in Gaza may run the risk of creating, a much, much bigger confrontation, even with the Palestinians? How do you see that?
Yeah, there's no question that Israeli leadership is in a very difficult position because they obviously cannot just let this go with no response whatsoever. But all of the responses that they might make are actually unattractive from an Israeli point of view. One of the things terrorist organizations always try to do is get their opponents to react in ways that will advance their cause, to overreact in various ways. So if Israel responds by simply pummeling Gaza, killing lots of civilians, eventually a Palestinian death toll that far exceeds the shocking Israeli death toll, then of course the political sympathies begin to shift back the other way. Israel also has the complication that Hamas has committed the crime of seizing hostages, which means any Israeli response threatens their own citizens being held by Hamas. That's a further complication as well. Trying to go in militarily, reoccupying Gaza means then you're in charge of it. Now you are responsible for running the place, and that is, costly, difficult. More Israelis will die as a result of that, etc. So the Israeli government, I think, is in a very, very difficult position in trying to figure out how to respond intelligently and not do what we did after 9/11, which was, declare a global war on terror, which ultimately did more harm to the United States than had happened to us on 9/11.
One of the interesting arguments coming from Israeli political circles and political coverage is from Tal Schneider, an Israeli journalist, that says Benjamin Netanyahu is to blame for allowing conditions to fuel Hamas, to money to come out of his obsession with preventing a Palestinian state from being created, to keep a rival to the Palestinian Authority in Mahmoud Abbas. She's saying he essentially gave Hamas refuge and sustenance to basically keep the Palestinians divided. I'm just interested in whether you think Tal Schneider has a point.
Yeah, I think the overall Israeli strategy for handling the Palestinian problem has clearly failed. And this is another illustration of that. And what Snyder is describing is one element of that. But the Israeli response of late, the last 8 to 10 years, has been basically to say this problem can be put on the back burner. We've built a wall. We've withdrawn from Gaza, but kept it encircled as essentially an open-air prison. And now we can go about normalizing relations with others. And the Trump administration, and to some degree the Biden administration, has gone along with that. And what Hamas has done, heinous as it is, has shattered that illusion, at least temporarily. So I think the recriminations within Israel, of course, are going to be enormous. Netanyahu will be criticized not just for a bad strategy, but for letting Israel's guard down. On the other hand, the Israeli right is likely to criticize Netanyahu's critics for sowing disunity as well. I think there's going to be, quite a bitter political fallout inside Israel in the wake of this, and that may take months, if not years, to play itself out.
One of the historical parallels, and no parallel is perfect, but in 2006, Israel invaded Lebanon, destroyed a significant portion of infrastructure, killed lots of Lebanese in an effort to rid Lebanon of Hezbollah, Iranian-backed Hezbollah. Today, Hezbollah is thriving, and so what are the lessons that Israel should have learned? What are the ways in which you deal with groups like this on a border, from your perspective?
I think it just shows you the limits of military power, that when you're dealing with large numbers of dispossessed people, there are limits to what you can do to them. Even if you have military superiority, you cannot kill all of them. You cannot eradicate them as a political force. And ultimately, one is forced to negotiate. One is forced to deal with them, regardless of what the past looks like. So I think the idea that any of these problems could simply be eliminated through force has been once again demonstrated to be weakened.
One of the things that's been going on around the environment here before this attack happened, this surprise attack, and I should say, maybe the Egyptians did see it coming, and maybe they did communicate to Prime Minister Netanyahu. That is, in the rumor mill right now. But fundamentally, what the dynamic was in the region were the Abraham Accords, and to some degree were the Saudis and the Israelis on the way to some form of normalization. And, basically a different kind of relationship, which could change the topography of power in the Middle East. And I'm just interested in whether you see that step was a provocation that drew out Hamas and potentially the Iranians.
Yeah, we certainly don't know exactly what the calculations were. Was this, kind of a preventive war kind of situation where they Hamas felt it had to act before this went any further? That's certainly a logical possibility. I think also the behavior of Israel on the West Bank, some of the acceleration of settlement activity under this government, et cetera, may have created a sense that windows were closing, et cetera. I don't know. It's certainly a possibility as well. I think the greater error, though, was simply the belief that there was sort of nothing that the Palestinians of any sort could or would do here. Again, that is not a justification for Hamas's action, which is a war crime by any definition. But it was the larger set of policies that it seems to me made people overconfident that they could keep the lid on this forever. And unfortunately, the consequences now have been visited, on innocent Israeli civilians. And again, now in response on innocent Palestinians, many of whom do not support Hamas.
Right. Well, every readout I've read of President Biden, of Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, of anyone dealing at an official level with Israel continues to talk about the importance of the two-state solution and a focus on a two-state solution as an endgame of this ongoing incendiary, convulsive situation. What is your view of the so-called two-state solution, given what we've seen unfold?
Yeah. I've always thought that the two-state solution, as envisioned by the Oslo Accords, was the best outcome here. I also think, unfortunately, that has now been overtaken by events, that the expansion of settlements in the West Bank, the discrediting of the Palestinian Authority, some in part due to its own actions, et cetera, the rightward shift within Israeli politics, all of those things have essentially rendered a two-state solution impossible. And I say that with great regret. And so I think when the Biden administration or other American officials talk about the two-state solution, they're actually, in a sense, discrediting themselves. They're talking about a world that no longer exists, and it's increasingly difficult to take them seriously. That this has become the sort of fig leaf that they trot out at press conferences, but it doesn't bear much resemblance to any of the political possibilities. And one of the things the United States needs to start doing is ask, well, if a two-state solution is not possible, then what are we in favor of? What are we going to support? And what are we going to try to encourage to put this conflict to an end once and for all?
Steve, why has the United States moved the USS Gerald R. Ford to this theater, into the Mediterranean, and what do you think it gets you?
Well, hopefully it doesn't have to be used in any way, but I do think it's a way of signaling American interest. It's a hedge against some possible outcomes, whether or not American citizens were endangered and had to be rescued. whether or not the war does escalate in a way that starts to threaten other American interests in the region. I don't think the Biden administration believes that it's actually going to be needed. But if it is needed, they wanted it to be there, and it is a way of signaling support, for Israel as well, which is something they're clearly trying to do.
One of the things I've learned from you over the years is how unexpected events can be triggered that have massive consequence down the road. And I've been watching some things that worry me. I've not reported much anywhere related to this, but the other day the United States shot down a Turkish drone that apparently was hovering over with armed missiles over U.S. troops in Syria. Maybe they were looking for Kurds or something, that one element. But we've also said Recep Erdogan, the president of Turkey, come out and say he's absolutely behind the Palestinians, that any assault on Palestinians is against him. Very, very hyperbolic language from Erdogan. At the same time, both political parties in the United States and President Biden are firmly behind Israel. Turkey's a NATO ally. Are we seeing fragility in our relationships and superstructures on defense that we need to be taking, be much more aware of?
Yeah, I think there's no question about this. I think the Biden administration has a real bandwidth problem now. I mean, just look at what's on their plate. They've got the war in Ukraine still underway, and where they're facing real opposition from Republicans about continuing support there. This event is not going to help because it doesn't make the Biden administration look particularly competent. Embarrassing to Netanyahu, but also embarrassing to the Biden administration. They have an economic war going on with China. They've got concerns about Taiwan as well. There's, obviously a very bad relationship with Russia. There's a big migration problem now that the Biden administration is having to deal with as well. And you might also notice, if we're thinking geopolitically, that China and Russia aren't actually directly implicated or involved in this particular conflict. They can sit this one out and continue to talk to everyone. So in some respects, this is good news for them. It's a distraction from the war in Ukraine. It's something that's going to keep us entangled for quite some time. And they're rather aloof from most of these things. So I think the larger geopolitical ramifications of this could be quite far reaching.
What is keeping antagonists who know that war over the long time is devastating to their populations, et cetera, from actually talking? You're talking about players talking, but if you look at the Israeli-Palestinian situation, they are not talking. If you look at Ukraine-Russia, they are not talking. So all of the kind of intractable conflicts out there are defined by players lining. It feels like very World War I-esque to me, that both sides are developing superstructures of allies that aren't actually pragmatically coming to terms with their conflict. What do you think is driving that?
Well, and you could add to that we don't talk to Iran in any substantial way, even though there's at least a potential for serious conflict there. And most of us tend to think that you really ought to be talking to potential adversaries as much as possible, not because you agree with them, but because they're the ones that you have the problems with that you're trying to work out. I mean, some part of this is that agendas are completely incompatible. That if Hamas is genuinely convinced that Israel should go out of business as a state, then there's not much to talk about. If the Israeli right is convinced that occupying all of the West Bank and making it one greater Israel and basically expelling the Palestinians or keeping them in an apartheid situation permanently, if that's their agenda, then there's not much to talk about there either. So some part of it is that. And I think finally what fuels it is when people feel that they don't have any alternatives, right? That there is no actual diplomatic or political path that might lead to a mutually acceptable outcome. Not an outcome that either one might like in its fondest dreams, but a mutually acceptable outcome. And I think we see this problem in lots of other circumstances around the world, not just this one, where as long as the objectives are incompatible and each side can tell itself a story that it ultimately will win if it just hangs on and get everything it wants, you don't have much basis for a discussion.
Some years ago at the Doha Forum, I want to tell people there was an official from Hamas there, and I spoke to this person and I said, aren't you worried about triggering an Israeli, reaction at some point that wipes you out or many Palestinians? And this person said, it was a man, he said, no, you can't kill a nation. And Israel taking those actions, like right now we know it has cut electricity, water, and food. which it controls for millions of people. But this official said you can't kill a nation. But he says what it will do will inflame a nation and make us look more legitimate in the eyes of the world. I'm interested in that triple layer chess game that someone is talking about that involves the murder of so many Israelis in this case and what will end up in the deaths of many Palestinians, looking at inflaming their legitimacy, and whether or not that is the future we're going to see.
I worry about that. Certainly that has been the belief of the more extreme parts of the Palestinian resistance. I think the basic insight that it's very, very difficult to eradicate a people once they have developed a national consciousness. We've seen this in all sorts of places, again, not just Israel, Palestine, that nations are very powerful forces of loyalty. Nationalism really is the most powerful political force in the world. And once that national consciousness is aroused, it's very difficult to do anything about it. We're seeing that in the Ukrainian resistance to Russia as just another illustration of how powerful that is. So in that sense, they're correct. You cannot bomb a nation out of existence. And to do so, of course, would be a crime against humanity in itself. Whether or not, of course, committing war crimes the other way advances your cause is a separate question, right? First of all, it's illegal. It tends to drive public opinion around the world away from you. Second, it hardens attitudes on the other side.
Right.
And I think we've seen throughout the Israeli-Palestinian conflict this mutual back and forth of each side doing horrible things to the other, and then discovering that, surprise, surprise, the other side doesn't want to talk to them.
Is Prime Minister Netanyahu strengthened or weakened by what has just happened?
I think there's no question he's been weakened by this. Again, his overall strategy for dealing with the Palestinians is shown to be a failure. To be presiding over the government which allowed this surprise to happen and was not prepared for it, and where the reaction time once the attack began was so slow, that just looks incompetent. And the fact that so many of the security forces were in the West Bank, backing up the settlers and leaving other Israeli citizens vulnerable will also, I think, be brought home to roost here. So I think this has really, very powerful negative implications for his.
And finally, Steve, you have a piece out right now on Foreign Policy Magazine's website, and it's titled, "Israel Could Win This Gaza Battle and Lose the War." Israel is, in my view, the undisputed superpower in the region. What do you mean that it could win the Gaza battle and lose the war?
Well, again, you see that they're militarily, they are far more powerful than Hamas. Ultimately, the damage, I believe, that will be inflicted on Hamas and on the Palestinians in Gaza will be greater than the considerable suffering that the Israelis have suffered themselves. But if Israel overreacts, if, in fact, the public opinion in the world begins to shift the other way, if they do, in other words, what we did after 9/11, then at a tactical level, Hamas could lose, but gain, again, putting the Palestinian issue back on the agenda, getting countries like the United States, the European Union, the Arabs to say, seriously, this is something we have to attend to, that there will not be peace in the Middle East until this issue is resolved. If they've restored that to the agenda, then it's a strategic success, even if it's accomplished in a quite heinous manner.
Well, Professor Stephen Walt, one of America's leading political scientists, I really appreciate your candor, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Nice talking with you, as always, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? Israel and the whole world, including the Palestinians, were shocked by the events of the last few days. It's legitimate that everyone is surprised by the breadth and scope of the Hamas attacks. But is it legitimate to be surprised that the Palestinians are demanding a way out of their situation? They've been shouting for decades to anyone that will listen, "Hey, we're here, remember us." This conflict is fueled by grievances, by injustice, and rage. But there's also cold-hearted strategy beneath the tears and moral anguish. When any military, Hamas, Israel, Russia, Ukraine, the U.S., anyone commits war crimes, it's absolutely unacceptable. But so, too, is trying to maintain the status quo in the Palestine-Israel relationship. Real leadership means standing up and resolving the underlying factors driving the ongoing destruction. And that's the bottom line.